And we are now going to start off the show with our first keynote talk, which is also a delightfully hopeful take on the subject of AI. I'm hoping, at least in the brief online, it finally feels like somebody is talking about it in a specific and positive way, which I am very, very excited about, especially in connection to the role of design. This talk is an invitation for design to redefine value in a new AI-driven technological paradigm. It is no longer about design as craft, but rather design as infrastructure, which means that we need to recalibrate our toolbox and the way we lead, and making sure that we lead in new ways. Author and researcher Marzia holds a PhD in organizational studies and is joined on stage by human geographer and award-winning design professional Giulio, joining us from Rotterdam and Palermo and London. Please welcome Marzia and Giulio.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. First time I attended Intersection Conference was exactly 10 years ago. I was one of the speakers there. It was a fantastic experience. And since then, I've been a very close friend. So it's a pleasure to be here again. Today with me, there is a, what's happening? Today, no. Today with me, there is Giulio, a colleague, is a geographer, and we started working together about a year ago. I run a blog called Design Mavericks. Design Mavericks is a space where we push the ideas around organizational change, inserting design as a way to look at the world in a different way. And so the perspective of Giulio has always been very inspiring for me. So this is the first time we're actually presenting together. I'm very excited about that. All right, we have the slides. Great. So let's start. So you probably have heard or read on LinkedIn, on magazines, that AI will take jobs or create new ones, that it will make us poorer or richer. The truth is that AI will do in itself absolutely nothing.
So it doesn't decide, it doesn't act in a human sense, at least for now.
The real important questions instead are, which companies, which leaders, which governance structures are deciding how AI is designed, deployed, and governed? In other words, which are the words that we're going to use for the rest of our presentation, whose intent is rendered.
Well, you're right, Marzia, because if we forget about this, fundamentally we let inanimate systems, AI systems, carry the blame, while the real actors escape responsibility. That's why we think design as a central, crucial role, because design, and we'll see, as governance and as mapping, makes those decisions visible. It reveals whose intent is rendered, whose values are possibly ignored.
Design is not virtuous per se. Design can be used to create maps, colonial maps that divide. It can be used to create dark patterns that manipulate, but it can also be used for participatory maps that include. It can also be used for structures that empower, right? So the point is not design per se, but is how design is positioned and used in any given system. And that's the reason why we say design isn't what you do, is where you stand.
Well, let me tell you this with only one microphone there. Design is not dead. far from it. He's actually entering one of his most strategic chapters yet, not because of his survival instinct, of course, but because the forces that are shaping our organizations and societies demand it. And artificial intelligence, systemic complexity, and shifting patterns of organizational decision-making are placing design in a central position, not as decoration or refinement, but as a core governance function. So in the next 30 minutes, we will do three things.
We'll explain why design's role is changing.
We will take a stand on what designers are responsible for.
And we'll show how to move from aspirations to governance in practice. Now, we practice this presentation with two mics. We have one. So you will have to, unfortunately, there's a lot of back and forth. So we will have to keep doing that. Now, okay, now it's me. Now, the gravitational center of design is shifting. And for me, this is a very important point because design over the decades has been seen and measured through its outputs, right? So you have deliverables, you have artifacts, you have interfaces, which fundamentally carry intrinsic and visible value. Now, what we're doing is shifting towards a world where design is seen as influencing infrastructures for decision making. So what matters now is exactly that. And so design is increasingly called upon not just to produce, but to orchestrate, not just to beautify, but to govern. And so in an AI-driven world or enabled world, pixel-level work, so the craft of creating, interfaces, that has been automated. That's done. We're over that, right? And so the focus now should be on structuring agency, which means ensuring that decisions, both humans and machines, are responsible, are transparent, this should actually happen on three separate levels. So the first level is regulatory level, where standards, policies, and laws apply. The second is the social technical level, where organizations and cultures take space. And then the third is algorithm level, where data and models steer outcomes. And so agency is actually the answer to the question whose intent is being rendered, which is the question that we use to open up this talk. And by agency, we mean the capacity and the authority to act intentionally. And so all of a sudden, design becomes the way through which organizations start seeing actually what they are doing and the consequences of what they are doing. And as an example, I would like to bring this one because these are actually very big words that, in a sense, can stay very high level, very abstract. But this is happening in all sorts of different corners of organizations. And I'm going to bring this example. So this is, I do quite a lot of coaching for design leaders. And I work with this leader who is inside a very large bank, a multinational bank, and in the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, for those of you who follow a bit of what's happening there, almost all banks have been fined because of the lack of system to prevent fraud. So just ING, I think he had a 775 million fine just for that. And so this is a big burning platform for them that they need to figure out. And AI seems to be the best way to fix that. And so let me explain you how that usually works. So they have large corporate clients. Let's imagine like a media company. And so for them to decide whether they want to work with this media company, the bank needs to check all sorts of different things about this company, like where is incorporated, what types of media do they do, what types of clients do they have, right? And that is done manually. So the client sends all sorts of different documents, some of which are PDFs with handwritten annotations, which hundreds of analysts have to read and check. So it's very hard to automate, and it takes weeks of man hours. So they thought, okay, can we speed up that through AI while also keeping accuracy? And so one of the big fours, which we love, entered saying, oh, yeah, use this model. It's going to save you X, Y, Z time. And so my design leader, let's call him Jan, goes and said, okay, great. Maybe let's run a prototype. Maybe let's actually see what type of time saving are we talking about. And so they start running this model. And actually it turns out that the model hallucinates. The model so gives answers that do not exist based absolutely on nothing. Or to the same question, you receive two very different answers, not quite clear why. And so analysts start not to trust the system at all. And so analysts start not to use the system at all. That means that all of the money spent on the system is actually not bringing the saving in time that the bank was hoping. So the designer goes, okay, that's very interesting. So the point here is actually designing for trust. The point here, the objective that we have here is to let the analyst trust the system. And so you have data experts, working on the accuracy of the model. That's one type of testing that they run. But the designers start running A/B testing or what type of information can be more trustworthy. And so one example of the A could be you receive an answer to your question. But the second could be I get an actual page of a document, real document, we highlighted the answer to my question. Which one do you trust the most, right? And so the work that then started became exactly to a design around trust. And so what that tells us is basically three things. The intent provides purpose, right? And in our case, is reducing time, is maintaining accuracy. Then there is the rendering. Rendering turns intent into form and into consequences, right? And then in our case, it's basically these very tangible tests that this designer decided to use. And mind you, it was very much ostracized at the very beginning because I said, oh, please, they just run this thing. Do we have to run months of tests? This is going to slow down the entire, system that we have in place here. And then the third is agency. Agency decides whose intent gets rendered, which in our case then becomes the analyst one, which is putting the user at the very center, which is going back to your discussion at the beginning, putting the user and the human at the very core of what we're trying to do.
Right.
You have
I have the mic now. So fundamentally, when we move from plan to execution, from strategy to implementation, but even from ideas into material, just to make you understand better this idea of rendering intent. That's when intent is rendered. The rendering of intent is also by definition design and is also the inner engine of mapping. And when a map stops being the reduced representation of a territory and starts being more its agent of change, then we have urban plans that turn into roads. We have colonial lines materializing in boundaries of concrete, and we have organizational charts turning into life enterprise processes. So the question is, how do we make sure that that intent is rendered with accountability? Well, that's where we leverage governance. That is how we structure agency to align intent with values, regulation, and consequences. So design as governance is not just another cost center. It powers what we call the profitability responsibility loop, which is about embedding responsibility at the point of action directly into workflows and algorithms to reduce the unmanaged risk that could erode trust and margins. And by aligning machine logic with the human goals, design makes AI-enabled products more compliant, more trusted, and more adoptable. So we see there is a relationship between trust and adoption. So a trust can enable adoptions from users, but, and we will see more in details later, for products and systems that are built around AI foundation models, this might not be enough for ensuring a durable profitability. So design as mapping we see as is a key of design as governance. So without mapping, complexity overwhelms. With mapping, complexity becomes more manageable. And I discovered this superpower, the power of mapping, when I was a geography student. And since then, I placed it at the very center of my designers' mindset and toolkits for the last 20 years. In my more recent work, I also realized that mapping actually exposes the traps that organizations fall into when they try to operationalize AI. It doesn't just expose them, but most time also helps very much to fix them. These traps are the product trap, the quant trap, and the agile trap. The product trap is the push for fast features over responsibility. And mapping here can really help by surfacing and centering the values, as well as embedding them in a very practical way through patterns, design patterns in an AI lifecycle to balance speed, velocity, and deliberation. The quant trap is, well, our very well-known over-reliance on metrics, right? So mapping here helps by placing values, again, alongside numbers to surface the richness that metrics alone wouldn't be able to capture. They would miss them. The last one, the agile traps, is the tendency to a continuous iteration and reorganization. Many of you are probably familiar with this idea of agile reorgs, right? And they play very much against this idea that we need to push for of risk management, because this tendency to continuous iteration and reorganization often happen without risk awareness. And here mapping helps again by protecting risk management and its leadership buy-in, by the way, that is very important, from the agile reorganization. How? Fundamentally, in simple terms, promoting a shift toward an adapt and pause rhythm within agile sprints. So we see there is a very interesting connection between these ideas that sounds abstract. We need time to digest them, to understand their depth, but there are immediately, thanks to mapping, implications and very practical application of this concept into practice. So design was used to be judged by outputs, the polished artifacts, the screens, the touch point. Now things are changing. Now it's more about responsive systems. So we are no longer designing things. We are mostly designing the actors, the rules, the agents, and the environment that shape behavior, human and machines alike. So we're moving from outputs away from artifacts, but not completely, to orchestration. And Marzia, in this shifting context, what barriers are organizations facing?
Efficiency is no longer enough. And organizations are really wrestling with how to adapt AI responsibly and profitably, not just efficiently. Because AI raises questions around trust, around accountability, around legitimacy. And so this makes design indispensable, because design is the bridge between practice and theory, between different perspectives, because design is one of the very few disciplines that is horizontal in a world of vertical specialism. And on the other side, governance is no longer static either, because we live in a world that is, in flux, that is subject to very rapid change, and is not just technological change. And so design provides the scaffolding to generate and create adaptive governance by creative line models and structures, by aligning data, experience, and regulations. And through it, governance becomes resilient, adaptive, and trustworthy. So this is a question that I always get asked is, who's going to be the design leader of the future, right? And my answer to that question is usually not those that have been, climbing the rankings of design, practice in organizations as we know it, and not those that actually have the job title. Which is kind of the tricky bit here. Because what I fundamentally believe is that who's going to lead this type of work is going to be the people that have the courage to step in the messy middle. The messy middle between technology, between compliance, and between human consciousness. And this is where design and design leaders now stand at the center of this, of designers mapping and designers governance. What do you think about it, Giulio?
But you know what I was thinking about this, Marzia.
Yeah, but they don't. They don't.
Well, a bit of geography.
It's a bit a rhetoric question.
Brought to design. I've been trained as a geographer, but I've been a designer for over 20 years. So for me, a map is a program for transformation. It's more an inside-out projection that prescribes reality rather than just reflecting it. And if you think carefully for a moment, the act of mapping isn't just about reflecting a structure, a product, or a territory. It's more often a means to shape and innovate upon them. So if you're familiar with service design, you can think this also through this lens of the tension between as is, the description that the mapping does, right? And the to be, the prescription, what you're kind of aiming for, right? So that map and the mapping is really an agent of transformation. It's just not a representation. And this, be careful, goes beyond the usual say that the map is not a territory, right? And we're gonna see this in interesting details. So mapping is also how intent gets rendered, right? So if the rendering of intent is design by definition and mapping is about how intent gets rendered, then you understand that we land into a concept of design as mapping. So it makes values legible and actionable across the AI lifecycle. And for instance, just an example like surfacing and cleaning bias out of hiring data. So surfacing is the moment where you make it visible. Cleaning is the moment where you make it actionable, right? So here is also the real move that happens with mapping. We move from value, so we need also to agree on a lot of terms here, understand it's dense. That's why we are here trying to, explain it better. So we move with mapping from value singular, usually money, revenue, right, to values plural, which is human, social, ecological. We had in the introduction a lot of emphasis on this point, as condition that we are very convinced make also profit durable. So it's not about telling the same story, go ethics. We found out that if you don't do it responsible, it's not going to be profitable. And AI is the first time where this is happening, right? So it's controversial, I know, but hopefully at the end of this, we're going to be, able to convince you about this point. So mapping does a lot of things. Another thing that does is allowing us to move from what we call the craft strategy continuum. There is a lot of conversation. Marzia spent a lot of time writing about this subject, myself as well, about, okay, what's happening in terms of like the separation between craft and strategy. We started saying, this talk saying that design is entering is one of his most strategic chapters yet. So we believe there is a continuum there that is actually distinctive between craft and strategy. That makes design distinctive and also make the toolkits and the mindset of the designer so valuable. And that means from fundamentally finding ourselves sketching a user flow on Monday and shaping an AI governance roadmap on Friday. So that's where we stand. Right, so something could be incredibly, manual, craft-oriented. Some other piece of work could be the next day incredibly strategic, and that's where also is the fascinating, nature of this job. But let's think more about, in practice, about application of design as mapping that are relevant for an AI-enabled systems. And I want to bring you a couple of examples. The NIST AI RMF. and the value-sensitive design. You might not be familiar with these frameworks. So the NIST is one of the most important AI risk management frameworks, and as surprise, mapping as its first core function, which precedes the other three that are manage, measure, and govern. And we got govern at the end. That is not another coincidence, right? We talk about governance as well. So basically, this framework explicitly requires organization to surface values and risks from the context before moving to the measurement phase, right? So even when I work with clients from more risk-aware sectors, typically finance, insurance, or healthcare, I found that this part, the mapping of the context, the surfacing of the values and the risks from the context, is one of the most overlooked, especially by organizations that basically throw themselves into poor implementation of this framework management. So they just want to run to the second step, that is measurement, without understanding that it's important to map out the context deeply. So that that time is very well invested. So in value-sensitive design, which is another fundamental framework for AI, we recognize mapping again as a mechanism that is linking technical and ethical choices. So within value-sensitive design, the methods are fundamentally mapping exercise that go from stakeholders mapping that you are familiar with to values hierarchies, system and scenario representations. So mapping emerges as the connective tissue that basically position values alongside metrics and embed also responsibility. And then we go back to the responsibility. Responsibility not as an afterthought, but as a precondition, right, for all the other components to fall in the right place. So we can use this design lens to look closer at generative AI systems, Marzia, and I think is the next part for you.
The MIT published a report lately, I think it was July, which is a gold mine. And this report is pretty blunt. It says that 95% of AI pilots fail. 95% is quite high. And not because models are weak, not because regulations block them, but because they don't integrate in enterprise workflows. Ta-da, surprise, surprise. So they don't adapt to concept, they don't deliver lasting value. And so the MIT calls this the Gen AI divide between high hype, high adoption, and very low transformation. It is not a technological failure, right? This is an organizational failure. And by now we know that we are experts of it. We've been talking about it forever. Generative AI tools are deployed without embedding into enterprise workflows, without surfacing real problems to solve, without mechanisms for adaptation. And the missing layer, we believe, is design. The MIT also believes that. They say it because they said there is an approach missing. And in our perspective, is design is mapping, is design is governance, is design as a way to create a connective tissue. We've been talking about these two concepts of design is mapping and design is governance quite a bit, and I would like to stop here with a slide to actually explain what we mean by that a bit more in detail. So design is mapping visualizes complexity across regulation, across organizational, technical, and socio-technical layers, so very different types of complexity. And so by doing that, it reveals contradictions, it offers an opportunity for stakeholder engagement in very novel ways, but it also surfaces submerged values and this idea of multiple types of values that Giulio was talking before. Design and governance instead sets decision rights. It turns the values surfaced by the maps as lenses for decision making. But there is a warning that we need to be aware of.
Yeah, there is. That's correct, Marzia. The storyline goes like this: more responsibility leads to more trust, more adoption, more value, revenue, and so forth. But that worked for software as a service. That really thrived on low marginal cost for implementation, right? Where fundamentally you build once, you add users, and revenues grows. The story is very different with the AI, in particular with generative AI, right? Where every interaction consumes compute, a lot of it. So scaling adoption, in this case, in this scenario, doesn't automatically help or strengthen the business case. It can really break it, right? So this is the kind of glitch in the story that we talk about. And what looks like success at the pilot scale can turn into fundamentally a cost spiral at the enterprise level. And that's why we argue for a two-pronged approach to responsibility. And again, you can look at this from a design perspective and think about it as doing the right things first and doing things right after, right? The double diamond, where you have like the effectiveness and efficiency. So the first responsibility as leadership is about fundamentally embedding value, trust, and governance by design based on the awareness of the socio-technical nature of AI system. Responsibility and sustainable profitability is more about designing for viable economics by considering, for instance, compute as a scarce resource, by orchestrating smartly models, which means focusing on the architecture, not just going bigger with the models, but improving the architectures around them, and also resisting hyperscaler lock-in, which means, in other terms, like thinking about different business models that can work when you develop AI-enabled products and services, and also like thinking about innovation, not just about sending out products that are wrappers around the large language models. So only when these two prongs are closed, then the profitability responsibility loops closes and works, and then responsibility can be turned into the engine for durable value. And this is true even without opening up the conversation and the topic of risks, because when design is marginalized, risk is left unmanaged fundamentally.
Designers mapping and designers governance will be the engine of enterprise and digital public infrastructure in the AI era. And this is a fundamental new threshold that in order to cross, we need the courage to step, eyes open, into the mess. Thank you very much.